The day Nina Valentine arrived at the Galactic Military Academy would go down in history as the moment everything changed. Not just for the Academy, but for the entire concept of interspecies military cooperation. Of course, nobody knew that yet, except perhaps Nina herself, who stood at the registration desk with a smile that made Officer Bubbles wish he could dissolve through the floor grating and hide in the maintenance ducts. "I assure you," Nina said, holding out her quantum-stamped credentials with practiced patience, "these are completely legitimate. Signed by Admiral Cthax himself." Officer Bubbles' gelatinous form rippled with distress, patches of neon orange pulsing through his normally calm blue membrane. The security scanner was giving him contradictory readings. On one hand, the credentials were genuine, but on the other, the biological readings from the being in front of him simply couldn't be right. No sentient species could function with such high levels of bone density, or survive with that much iron in their hemoglobin. From the observation deck above, Sergeant Crix SLX watched the unfolding scene with growing fascination. His crystalline form hummed at a frequency that made nearby windows vibrate slightly, a sure sign of excitement for his species. "Lieutenant Pax 12, he called to his mechanical colleague, "what do your sensors make of this?" The robotic officer's optical sensors whirred as they adjusted focus. "Fascinating readings, Sergeant. The human's core temperature alone would be fatal to most species we know. And those muscle densities, she could probably snap a Zentari support beam like a twig." Commander Vex slithered closer to the window, her scales shifting through various shades of purple as she processed the information. "The real question is, why now? Humans have been part of the Galactic Coalition for 3 standard cycles, but they've never attempted to integrate into our military institutions before." Below, the situation was escalating. 2 Zentari cadets had fainted at the mere mention of Earth's gravity levels, and Officer Bubbles had split himself into 3 quivering parts, each clutching different sections of the admission paperwork. "Perhaps," Crix SLX mused, his crystal structure refracting the twin suns' light into dancing rainbows, "it's time we updated our understanding of standard physical capabilities." Nina Valentine stood patiently through it all, her regulation-perfect uniform somehow making her look even more imposing. She'd known this wouldn't be easy. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy, after all. Deathworlders, they called Earth's inhabitants, with a mixture of fear and awe. A planet so hostile that its native species had evolved to be practically indestructible by galactic standards. Finally, Officer Bubbles managed to pull himself together, literally and figuratively. "Very well, Cadet Valentine. Your credentials are, in order. Though I must note that several of our training facilities may need to be, reinforced." Nina's smile widened just slightly. "I'm sure I can adapt to your equipment's limitations, officer." The way she said it sent a shiver through every being in the reception area. Crix SLX made his decision. He descended to the reception area, his crystalline form casting prismatic patterns across the walls. "Cadet Valentine, welcome to the Galactic Military Academy. I'll be your primary instructor during your time here." Nina snapped to attention, executing a perfect regulation salute that somehow managed to look both respectful and slightly terrifying. "Thank you, Sergeant. I look forward to learning everything you have to teach." "And we," Crix SLX replied, noting how the other cadets were maintaining a perfect 3-meter radius around Nina, "look forward to learning from you as well." As they walked toward the orientation hall, Crix SLX couldn't help but notice how Nina's footsteps left slight indentations in the supposedly indestructible floor plating. Behind them, he could hear Officer Bubbles frantically requesting equipment upgrades through his comm unit. The orientation hall fell silent as Nina entered. The floating Eric's cadets drifted higher toward the ceiling, while the serpentine Vasacs coiled tighter around their perches. Nina took a seat in the front row, the reinforced chair creaking slightly under what seemed like a perfectly normal weight for her species. Commander Vex began the standard orientation speech, her scales now a professional shade of blue-green. "Welcome, cadets, to the most prestigious military training institution in the known galaxy. You represent the finest your respective species have to offer. As she spoke, Nina pulled out a datapad and began taking notes. The simple action somehow made it look like she was planning tactical maneuvers rather than just recording information about class schedules and facility locations. Crix SLX, standing at the back of the hall, felt his crystalline structure vibrate with anticipation. In 15 cycles of teaching at the academy, he'd never felt quite this level of uncertainty about a new class. Nina Valentine wasn't just a new cadet, she was a harbinger of change. The real question was, would the academy survive the experience? The academy's engineering team had spent all night reinforcing the combat simulation chamber. They'd upgraded the structural integrity fields, doubled the safety protocols, and even installed a new quantum-based emergency shutdown system. Still, as Sergeant Crix SLX watched Nina Valentine walk into the training area, he wondered if it would be enough. All systems are at 200% capacity, Lieutenant Pax 12 reported, her mechanical appendages working frantically across multiple control panels. Though I should note that we've never needed to exceed 75% before. Commander Vex, coiled around her observation post, had settled on a nervous shade of mauve. Has anyone noticed that she doesn't sweat? Even after running the endurance course that made 3 Centauri require medical attention. Humans have something called thermal regulation, Officer Bubbles contributed, his membrane rippling with academic interest despite his anxiety. Apparently, they can maintain their core temperature through some sort of liquid cooling system. Nina stood in the center of the chamber, looking deceptively ordinary in her training gear. The only hint of her Deathworlder nature was the way the reinforced floor plates compressed slightly under each step. Beginning combat assessment, the chamber's AI announced. Scenario 1, Urban Pacification. The holographic environment materialized around Nina, a cityscape filled with potential threats and civilian bystanders. Most cadets took at least 15 minutes to complete this scenario. Nina took one look at her surroundings and smiled. What happened next would require the Academy's physics department to revise several of their textbooks. Nina moved like gravity was more of a suggestion than a law. She used walls as springboards, turned holographic debris into impromptu weapons, and demonstrated that human spatial awareness operated on an entirely different level from other species. Did she just? Commander Vex's scales shifted to a shocked white as Nina used the momentum from a backflip to kick a hostile target while simultaneously throwing a piece of holographic rubble to disable another one behind her. Calculate trajectories in three-dimensional space while executing a complex physical maneuver. Pax 12 finished. Yes. Yes, she did. The simulation AI was struggling to keep up. Warning, participant exceeding expected performance parameters. Adjusting difficulty. Nina didn't just complete the scenarios, she rewrote them. When faced with a hostage situation, she used the building's architecture in ways the designers had never intended. When confronted with multiple threats, she turned their own positions against them. Look at her heart rate, Officer Bubbles noted, his form pressed against the monitoring station. It's elevated, but nowhere near danger levels. She's not even pushing herself. Crix SLX's crystalline form hummed with a mixture of awe and concern. She's not just good, she's redefining what we consider possible. As if to prove his point, Nina had just turned a tactical retreat into an ambush that the simulation AI hadn't even recognized as a valid option. The holographic opponents, programmed with the best tactical algorithms in the galaxy, were being outmaneuvered by what Nina casually called parkour. Scenario complete, the AI announced, sounding almost relieved. Time, 3 minutes, 42 seconds. New record established. Nina landed gracefully in the center of the chamber as the holograms faded. That was fun, she said, not even breathing heavily. When do we get to the advanced courses? Commander Vex's scales had shifted to a color that didn't have a name in any galactic language. Advanced courses. Oh yes, Nina's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. I've been studying your training manuals. There's so much potential for combining different techniques. For instance, has anyone ever tried integrating zero-G combat with urban warfare scenarios? The control room fell silent. Officer Bubbles slowly divided into two worried masses. Actually, Crix SLX found himself saying, "That's not a bad idea." Everyone turned to stare at him. Think about it, we've always separated our training modules because we assumed they were too complex to combine. But maybe we've been limiting ourselves. Nina beamed. Exactly. And what about underwater combat? Or extreme temperature environments? Earth has all kinds of interesting training grounds we could. One step at a time, Cadet, Crix SLX interrupted, noting how Officer Bubbles was starting to turn an alarming shade of green. Let's focus on mastering the standard courses first. But as Nina launched into an enthusiastic discussion about the potential applications of vertical terrain in tactical situations, Crix SLX realized something important. The Academy wasn't just teaching Nina, she was teaching them. Every limitation she broke, every assumption she challenged, was forcing them to evolve. Later that day, in the faculty lounge, the instructors gathered for an emergency meeting. "We need to completely redesign the curriculum," Commander Vex announced, her scales cycling through professional shades of blue. "Not just for Valentine, but for everyone. She's shown us that our current standards are insufficient." Lieutenant Pax 12's processors whirred in agreement. The question is, how do we create challenges that are difficult enough for a Deathworlder without being impossible for everyone else? Officer Bubbles, who had finally managed to maintain a single coherent form, raised a pseudopod. Perhaps that's the wrong approach. Instead of separating the training, we should focus on teaching them to work together. Each species has unique advantages and disadvantages, Crix SLX finished. Valentine's presence isn't just challenging our physical training standards, it's challenging our entire approach to military education. As if to emphasize his point, a distant crash echoed through the facility, followed by an apologetic, "Sorry. Still getting used to your artificial gravity settings." Commander Vex's scales flickered briefly to amused purple before settling back to professional blue. "Well, one thing's certain, the next few cycles are going to be very interesting." Interesting? Officer Bubbles quivered. That's one way to put it. I've had to requisition 3 times our normal amount of structural repair materials. And she's only been here 2 days. But beneath the anxiety and chaos, there was an undercurrent of excitement. The Galactic Military Academy had grown somewhat complacent over the years, comfortable in its traditions and assumptions. Nina Valentine hadn't just enrolled as a cadet, she'd initiated a revolution in military education. And somewhere in the training areas, a human Deathworlder was probably figuring out new ways to make their physics professors question their career choices. 3 weeks into the academic cycle, the cafeteria incident happened. Like most groundbreaking moments at the Academy since Nina Valentine's arrival, it began with good intentions and ended with Officer Bubbles filing multiple incident reports. "I just wanted to help," Nina explained to Sergeant Crix SLX, standing beside a table of trembling Zentari cadets. The remains of what had been a standard-issue nutrient tray lay crumpled on the floor, bent almost in half by what Nina had called a gentle tap. The Zentari was choking, she continued. "I performed the Heimlich maneuver before remembering that their respiratory system doesn't exactly work like ours." Crix SLX's crystalline form vibrated with barely contained amusement. "And the reason Cadet ZYX-427 is now clinging to the ceiling?" Well, Nina shuffled slightly, her movement causing several nearby cadets to flinch. "I might have used a bit too much force. In my defense, Earth's gravity is about 3 times stronger than what they're used to." The incident, however, marked a turning point. While half the Zentari cadets now refused to eat within 5 meters of Nina, Cadet ZYX-427 had developed an unexpected fascination with human emergency response techniques. "You really do that to each other? Deliberately apply abdominal pressure?" ZYX-427 asked during their next shared combat tactics class, their antennae twitching with curiosity rather than fear for the first time. Only in emergencies, Nina explained. Though I guess I should have considered the differences in xenophysiology first. Fascinating. ZYX-427's electromagnetic aura pulsed with genuine interest. Perhaps we could develop modified versions for different species. And just like that, the first real bridge between the Deathworlder and her classmates was built. Commander Vex observed this development with her scales shifting through thoughtful shades of blue-green. Progress, she noted to Crix SLX during their daily briefing. Though not quite in the way we expected. The changes spread gradually. During zero-gravity training, Nina's seemingly reckless but incredibly effective techniques began to draw attention. The floating Eric's cadets, initially smug about their natural advantages in space, found themselves begrudgingly impressed by her ability to use inertia in ways they'd never considered. It's all about thinking three-dimensionally, Nina explained to a group of fascinated Erics, demonstrating a complex maneuver that involved using wall rebounds to change direction. On Earth, we have sports like parkour and gymnastics that. Sports, interrupted Cadet Ether 9, their gas-filled form rippling with interest. You do this for entertainment? The concept of humans engaging in potentially dangerous physical activities for fun nearly caused another mass fainting incident among the more sensitive species. But it also sparked an unprecedented wave of interest in human culture. The Academy's information terminals began logging increased searches about Earth, human sports, and Deathworld survival strategies. Nina found herself surrounded by curious cadets during meal times, peppered with questions about everything from human martial arts to the concept of extreme sports. Even the Gelatinous species, traditionally the most risk-averse of all cadets, showed interest, albeit from a safe distance. Officer Bubbles reported a 300% increase in requests for human historical and cultural data, though he noted with some concern that many queries centered around something called Parkour Fails compilation videos. The real breakthrough came during the first joint combat exercise. The scenario, a complex hostage rescue operation requiring multiple teams to coordinate. Traditionally, species stuck with their own kind during these exercises, playing to their natural strengths. This time was different. Listen, Nina addressed her mixed-species team, which included 2 nervous Centauri, 3 floating Erics, and a particularly brave Gelatinous cadet named Splish. We're not going to win this by playing it safe. Each of us has unique abilities that, combined properly, could give us an unbeatable advantage. Splish rippled anxiously. But the traditional approach. Got beaten by a human doing parkour, ZYX-427 interrupted, their antennae twitching with newfound confidence. Perhaps it's time for a new approach. What followed was either tactical brilliance or controlled chaos, depending on who you asked. Nina's team used the Centauri's electromagnetic sensitivity to detect movement through walls, while the Erics provided aerial reconnaissance. Splish, inspired by Nina's creative approach to physics, discovered that their gelatinous form could squeeze through ventilation systems to gather intelligence. And Nina? She did what humans do best, she adapted, improvised, and occasionally terrified everyone with her species' casual disregard for what should be physically impossible. Their team completed the exercise in record time, with Nina literally carrying an injured Centauri teammate to safety while using her free hand to provide covering fire. The sight of a Deathworlder protecting a supposedly friendlier species instead of competing with them caused quite a stir. In the faculty lounge afterward, Commander Vex's scales had settled on a shade of impressed purple. They're learning from each other, she observed. Valentine's presence isn't just challenging our physical standards, it's breaking down social barriers that have existed for generations. Lieutenant Pax 12's mechanical form hummed in agreement. The latest training scores show improvement across all species. They're pushing themselves harder, thinking more creatively. And breaking more equipment, Officer Bubbles added, though his membrane showed colors of pride rather than just his usual anxiety. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. Crix SLX watched through the window as Nina sat with a mixed group of cadets in the courtyard, explaining something that involved a lot of energetic hand gestures. The other cadets, instead of maintaining their usual safety distance, were leaning in with interest. "You know," he said, his crystalline form refracting the light into patterns that seemed somehow more optimistic than usual, "when the Academy first accepted a human cadet, we thought we'd be teaching her about galactic military standards. Instead, Commander Vex finished, her scales rippling with amusement, she's teaching us about the true meaning of unity in diversity." The lesson was driven home the next day when Nina's team volunteered to demonstrate their new hybrid tactics to the entire Academy. The demonstration ended with several broken training drones, one slightly singed Centauri, who couldn't stop grinning, and a gelatinous cadet who had discovered they could change color to match their surroundings if they concentrated hard enough. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant?" Nina asked after the demonstration, standing at perfect attention despite having just completed a series of maneuvers that defied several laws of physics. "Granted, Cadet Valentine. I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible when we stop seeing our differences as limitations and start seeing them as tactical advantages." Crix SLX's crystalline form hummed in agreement. "I believe, Cadet Valentine, that you might be right about that." As if to prove her point, a group of cadets nearby was already discussing how to combine Centauri electromagnetic sensitivity with human parkour techniques for enhanced urban reconnaissance. The galaxy, it seemed, wasn't quite ready for what happened when you combined Deathworlder innovation with alien diversity. But it was certainly going to find out. The Academy's twin suns had barely risen when the emergency alarms began blaring. Sergeant Crix SLX was in the middle of his morning crystalline alignment when his communication array lit up with urgent messages. Something had gone catastrophically wrong in the Academy's quantum core, the massive power source that maintained everything from artificial gravity to life support systems. "Status report," Commander Vex demanded, her scales a sharp, alert red as she slithered into the emergency command center. The room was already crowded with officers and technical staff, their various biological displays showing different shades of panic. Lieutenant Pax 12's mechanical form was connected directly to the facility's mainframe, her processors working at maximum capacity. "The quantum containment field is destabilizing. We have approximately 3 hours before total failure." "And if that happens?" Officer Bubbles asked, though his rippling membrane suggested he already knew the answer. "Best case scenario? The Academy loses all power," Pax 12 replied. "Worst case? The quantum core goes critical and takes half the continent with it." The room fell silent, save for the persistent wail of emergency sirens. The Academy had never faced a crisis of this magnitude. Standard evacuation procedures would take at least 5 hours, 2 hours more than they had. That's when Nina Valentine burst through the door, still in her physical training gear, followed by an unlikely group of cadets, ZYX for 27, Ether 9, and Splish. "Permission to speak, Commander." Nina stood at attention, though her eyes kept darting to the facility schematics displayed on the main screen. Commander Vex's scales shifted to a curious purple. "Granted, Cadet Valentine. We have an idea," Nina said, gesturing to her teammates. "But it's about as unorthodox as it gets." Crix SLX's crystalline form hummed with interest. "At this point, Cadet, unorthodox might be exactly what we need." Nina quickly outlined their plan. It was, as promised, completely unorthodox. It was also possibly brilliant, definitely dangerous, and their only real chance at preventing disaster. "The main problem is reaching the core's manual reset controls," Nina explained. "The radiation levels are too high for most species, and the automated systems are completely locked down." "But," ZYX for 27 interrupted, their antennae twitching with excitement, "humans have this incredible radiation resistance compared to most species. And with our combined abilities." The plan was audacious. Nina would physically enter the core chamber, something that would be fatal to most species but merely, really uncomfortable, her words, for a human. ZYX-427 would use their electromagnetic sensitivity to guide her through the maze of quantum filaments. Ether-9 would help manage the intense heat using their natural cooling abilities, while Splish had discovered they could act as a living radiation shield when properly motivated. Commander Vex Scales cycled through every shade of concern in her species' considerable range. This is extremely dangerous, even by human standards. With all due respect, Commander, Nina replied with that uniquely human mix of politeness and determination. Dangerous is kind of our specialty. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in interspecies cooperation. While Nina's team prepared for their core descent, the rest of the Academy mobilized in ways nobody had thought possible. Zentari cadets used their electromagnetic abilities to help stabilize critical systems. Eric's students created carefully controlled wind tunnels to help vent excess heat. Even the normally timid Gelatinous cadets found their courage, forming living conduits for emergency power distribution. "It's amazing," Officer Bubbles observed, his form uncharacteristically steady despite the crisis. A few months ago, most of these species wouldn't even train in the same room together. As the final preparations were made, Crix SLX approached Nina. "Cadet Valentine, I feel I should remind you that this goes far beyond normal training parameters." Nina checked the seals on her protective gear, modified from standard issue because, as usual, human requirements were significantly different from the norm. "Don't worry, Sergeant. Like I said during my first day, I'm pretty good at adapting to equipment limitations." The descent into the core chamber was a nerve-wracking experience for everyone involved. Nina navigated through passages designed for maintenance drones, guided by ZYX-427's electromagnetic readings. Ether-9 circulated continuously through specially designed vents, fighting to keep the temperature manageable, while Splish stretched their gelatinous form into protective barriers where needed. Approaching the manual reset controls, Nina's voice crackled over the comm system. "The radiation readings are interesting." "Interesting?" Commander Vex Scales had gone almost transparent with worry. "Define interesting." "Let's just say I'm glad humans evolved on a planet with natural background radiation," Nina replied. There was a pause, filled only by the sound of straining metal and humming quantum fields. "Also, is the core supposed to be making that noise?" Before anyone could answer, multiple alarms began blaring. The quantum containment field was collapsing faster than predicted. "Valentine," Crix SLX's voice cut through the chaos, "you need to get out of there. Now." "Almost got it," Nina grunted. Through the monitoring systems, they could see her physically wrestling with controls that were never meant to be operated manually. "Just need to, there." The effect was immediate. The facility's power grid stabilized, emergency systems reset, and the quantum core's ominous humming settled into its normal rhythm. The crisis was averted, but Nina's team wasn't done yet. They still had to get out, navigating through passages now flooded with residual radiation and quantum discharge. Slight problem," Nina's voice came through the comm, strained but still determined. "The radiation seems to have fused some of the access panels. I'm going to have to get creative." "Creative?" Officer Bubbles split into 3 worried masses. "Last time she got creative, we had to rebuild the combat simulation chamber." What followed was a display of human ingenuity that would be talked about for generations. Nina, working with her alien teammates, turned the very problems they faced into solutions. Quantum discharge became improvised propulsion. Radiation barriers became makeshift shields. Even the failing gravity in some sections became an advantage, with Nina using it to parkour her way through otherwise impassable sections. When they finally emerged from the core chamber, Nina slightly singed but grinning, ZYX-427 buzzing with electromagnetic overload, Ether-9 glowing from heat absorption, and Splish looking slightly more transparent than usual, the entire academy burst into cheers. Commander Vex's scales had settled on a color that the Academy's xenobiologists would later classify as proud beyond description. "Well done, cadets. All of you." "Thank you, Commander," Nina replied, still standing at attention despite having just saved the entire facility. "Though I do have one small request." "Yes. Can we add quantum core maintenance to the standard training curriculum? I think we just proved it might come in handy." Crix SLX's crystalline form vibrated with what might have been laughter. "I believe, Cadet Valentine, that you've earned the right to make that suggestion." As medical teams checked over the unlikely heroes, Officer Bubbles was already starting on the incident reports. He'd need to create several new categories just to describe what had happened. But more importantly, something fundamental had changed at the Academy. The barriers between species, already weakened by Nina's presence, had been shattered completely by this crisis. Cadets who once feared the Deathworlder in their midst now looked at her, and each other, with new respect and understanding. The galaxy might not have been ready for what happened when you combined human determination with alien cooperation, but it had just gotten a spectacular demonstration. The day of the graduation ceremony arrived with all the subtlety of a quantum core breach. The Academy's Great Hall, hastily reinforced after the crisis, was packed with dignitaries from across the galaxy. Many had come specifically to see the infamous human cadet who had turned the institution's traditions upside down, quite literally, in the case of the anti-gravity combat techniques she'd pioneered. Sergeant Crix SLX stood at attention, his crystalline form polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the morning light in prismatic patterns across the hall. Beside him, Commander Vex's scales shifted through formal shades of blue as she reviewed her speech one final time. "Still can't believe it's only been one cycle," Lieutenant Pax 12 commented, her mechanical form humming with what could only be described as nostalgia. "Feels like everything's changed." "Everything has changed," Officer Bubbles replied, his membrane displaying a complex swirl of emotions. "Do you know I haven't had to file a single species segregation complaint in the last 3 months? Though the equipment replacement requests have tripled." The ceremony began with traditional pomp and circumstance, or at least, as much tradition as could be maintained when half the graduating class had adopted what they called Valentine-style modifications to their formal uniforms. Nina sat among her fellow graduates, her presence no longer causing nervous tremors among the other species. Instead, she was surrounded by a mix of cadets that would have been unthinkable a cycle ago, ZYX for 27 hovering nearby, their antennae adorned with ceremonial metallics, Ether 9 floating at a friendly distance, their gaseous form tinted with proud colors, and Splish, who had learned to maintain a perfectly professional shape even while vibrating with excitement. Commander Vex took the podium, her scales settling into a formal pattern. Distinguished guests, honored faculty, and graduating cadets. When this academic cycle began, we thought we knew what we were, the galaxy's premier military training institution, preserving traditions that had served us well for generations. She paused, her scales rippling with amusement. We were wrong. A murmur ran through the audience. The arrival of our first human cadet didn't just challenge our physical training standards, it challenged our entire understanding of what was possible. Both in terms of individual capability, and more importantly, in terms of what we could achieve together. Nina sat straighter in her reinforced chair, though her expression remained professionally neutral. Around her, her fellow graduates exchanged knowing looks. The recent quantum core crisis proved something we should have realized long ago, Commander Vex continued. Our differences are not limitations to be overcome, but advantages to be combined. Each species brings unique strengths to our collective defense. And sometimes, her scales flickered with humor, it takes a Deathworlder doing parkour through our carefully established protocols to make us see that. The ceremony proceeded with the presentation of credentials. Each graduate received their quantum-stamped certification, but this year was different. Instead of being grouped by species, they were called up in their training teams, the mixed species units that had become the new standard. When Nina's team was called, they approached as one, human, Centauri, Eric's, and Gelatinous cadet moving in perfect coordination. The sight would have been unthinkable a cycle ago. Now it drew appreciative murmurs from the assembled dignitaries. Cadet Valentine, Commander Vex announced, her scales shifting to a formal gold, step forward. Nina stepped up to the podium, her movements carefully measured to avoid cracking the floor plates, a skill she'd perfected over many practice sessions. In recognition of your unprecedented contributions to the Academy's evolution, and your role in establishing new standards for interspecies cooperation, you are hereby granted not only graduation status but also a permanent position on our training advisory board. Nina's eyes widened slightly, the only break in her professional demeanor. Thank you, Commander. I'm honored. Don't thank me yet, Commander Vex's scales flickered with amusement. Wait until you see the curriculum reforms we need help with. Apparently, every incoming class now wants to learn something called extreme tactical parkour. The ceremony concluded with another break from tradition. Instead of the formal dismissal, the graduates demonstrated their new combined species combat techniques. Nina led her team through a series of maneuvers that had the audience gasping, and the facility's structural engineers wincing. Later, at the reception, Sergeant Crix SLX found Nina standing by a window, watching the twin suns set. Credit for your thoughts, Cadet. Or should I say, Advisory Board Member Valentine. Nina smiled. Just thinking about that first day, when Officer Bubbles nearly dissolved trying to process my application. We've come so far since then. Indeed. Crix SLX's crystalline form hummed thoughtfully. Though I suspect this is just the beginning. Oh. Nina raised an eyebrow. 3 more human cadets have applied for next cycle, he revealed. Along with species we've never had before. Word has spread about our new, adaptive training methods. Nina's grin widened. Well, we'll need to reinforce more than just the training facilities then. Have you considered installing parkour courses in the orientation area? Before Crix SLX could respond, an excited commotion drew their attention. A group of graduating cadets was demonstrating what they called multi-species momentum transfer techniques, essentially using each other's natural abilities to perform maneuvers that defied several laws of physics. You know, Nina observed, when I first arrived, everyone was so worried about whether the Academy could handle a Deathworlder. Nobody stopped to ask whether Galaxy was ready for what would happen when different species really learned to work together. And is it? Crix SLX asked. Ready, that is. Nina watched as ZYX-427 used their electromagnetic abilities to launch Splish into a perfect arc, while Ether-9 created air currents to guide their trajectory. Ready or not, I think change is coming. We've proven that we're stronger together than apart. That our differences can be advantages instead of obstacles. That sounds suspiciously like a revolution, Cadet Valentine. The best kind, Sergeant. The kind that brings people together instead of pushing them apart. She straightened her uniform. Now, if you'll excuse me, some of the new cadets want to learn about something called Zero-G parkour wrestling. Crix SLX watched her go, his crystalline form vibrating with what might have been laughter. The Academy had changed more in one cycle than in the previous 50. And somehow, he suspected, this was just the beginning. On the other side of the reception hall, Officer Bubbles was already starting new requisition forms for reinforced training equipment. Commander Vex's scales had settled into a shade that perfectly matched the sunset, proud, hopeful, and full of possibilities. The galaxy might not have been ready for Deathworlders in their military academies. But thanks to one human cadet who refused to accept limitations, it was about to discover just how far they could go together. And somewhere in the training areas, the sound of breaking physics could be heard once again.